You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thanks for joining Revolution 250, where we look at events that took place 250 years ago this week. This is from the American Revolution Podcast, but it's just a short bonus episode to remind you about important anniversaries of the Revolution. This week, we remember how Massachusetts created an army. Over the course of the winter of 1774-75, tension was high in Massachusetts. Militia had effectively chased the regulars into Boston and prevented the royal governor, Thomas Gage, from governing anywhere in the colony outside of the city of Boston. Gage had written to officials in London seeking massive military reinforcements before he would try to restore order to the colony. Gage had been chased into Boston in the fall of 1774, but by the time he wrote back to London, London responded and was able to send the necessary army. Would take many, many months. So, of course, both sides had to sit and wait over the winter for the next steps. With the royal government bottled up in Boston, Patriot leaders established the Massachusetts Provincial Congress to govern the rest of the colony. The first Provincial Congress was organized in the fall of 1774, following Gage's proclamation that he would not allow the elected colonial legislature to meet. Those elected officials organized their own meeting in Salem. Then they met for a few days in Concord, and finally moved to Cambridge, just across the river from Boston. The Patriots at that time sent a letter of grievances to General Gage and directed tax collectors not to turn over their money to the royal government. They also took quite a few actions, preparing for the inevitable British response to their rebellions. By the time the Second Provincial Congress met again in March of 1775, they decided to meet out in Concord rather than Cambridge because being so close to the British Army in Boston was considered a danger. Tension had grown much worse over the course of the winter. Pretty much everyone expected that Gage and the regulars would begin offensive military actions to regain control of the colony some point in the spring. The regulars had already made several offensive raids over the winter in an attempt to seize Patriot arms and ammunition. Before I go too far, I want to say the name Provincial Congress may be confusing to some. Later in the Revolutionary War, the term provincials typically referred to Tory or Loyalist groups. This was because the Loyalists had not yet accepted the decision to declare independence, and so they used the traditional term provincials. But in 1775, before anyone had declared independence, Patriot groups also used the term provincial. John Hancock served as president of the Congress, with Benjamin Lincoln as secretary. Among other things, the Provincial Congress selected Massachusetts delegates to send to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. The leaders of the Provincial Congress had no illusions about the coming war. They were doing everything they could to prepare for it. This included trying to stock up on arms and ammunition, as well as providing more intensive training for their militia. They even reached out to local Indian tribes to garner their support in the coming fight. On August 5, 1775, the Provincial Congress adopted rules and regulations for their new army. Its 53 articles spelled out basic rules and regulations for the soldiers and officers. The Congress had already chosen Artemus Ward to command the army after Jedediah Preble had refused the offer because of his age and infirmity. While the soldiers who would make up this army still remained at home, waiting for the expected British attacks, the Provincial Congress spelled out its reasons for creating these army regulations. Quote, "Whereas the great law of self-preservation may suddenly require our raising and keeping an army of observation and defense, in order to prevent or repel any further attempts to enforce the late and cruel oppressive acts of the British Parliament, which are evidently designed to subject us and the whole continent to the most ignominious slavery. And whereas in the case of raising and keeping such an army, it will be necessary that the officers and soldiers in the same be fully acquainted with their duty, and that the articles, rules, and regulations thereof be made as plain as possible." So Congress was making clear to the world that it would not allow itself to be pushed around, even as the British Army itself would be used to try to suppress them, and for that they needed an actual army. They considered it their duty to defend their freedoms. In the introductory paragraphs before they set forth the rules and regulations, the Congress said as follows, quote, having seriously considered the duty we owe to God, to the memory of such invincible worthies, to the King, to Great Britain, our country, ourselves, and posterity, do think it our indispensable duty, by all lawful ways and means in our power, to recover, maintain, defend, and preserve the free exercise of all those civil and religious rights and liberties for which many of our forefathers fought, bled, and died, and to hand them down entire for the free enjoyment of the latest posterity. Now, years after the Revolution, John Adams famously said, quote, "The Revolution was effective before the war commenced. The Revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, a change in their religious sentiments of duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affections of the people was the real American Revolution." During the first week of April, 1775, the continent was still at peace, but the colonists knew that open warfare, with the might of the British Army upon them, was coming soon. Regardless of the consequences, they were prepared to defend their rights or die trying. While the first shot had not yet been fired, for the people of Massachusetts, the Revolution had already begun. Thanks again for joining me for this Revolution 250 moment. For more on these events, please listen to episode 52 of the American Revolution podcast.